My parents locked me in the car during my grandfather's funeral because my thrifted suit embarrassed them in front of Atlanta's elite. They told me to buy a coffee and stay out of sight while they mourned the man who raised me. I sat there sweating in the Georgia heat until my phone rang. It was my grandfather's lawyer. He told me to skip the burial and get to his office immediately because it was time to claim my empire. Before I share how I made my family regret that day, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut off toxic family to find your true worth. The heavy thud of the SUV doors locking echoed loudly in the cramped space. I grabbed the handle, but it was completely useless. The child locks were engaged from the outside. Outside the tinted windows, the sweltering Atlanta heat was already baking the asphalt of the megachurch parking lot. My mother Brenda marched up to my window. Her designer heels clicked sharply against the pavement. She tapped her perfectly manicured acrylic nail against the glass, glaring at me with absolute disgust. I rolled down the window just an inch, immediately hit by the humid Georgia air and the heavy scent of her expensive perfume. "You are wearing a thrifted suit to your grandfather's funeral," she hissed, keeping her voice low so the valet attendants would not hear her. "You dropped out of Spelman to play with computers in your bedroom. Sydney and Trent are inside hosting the mayor right now. You are not going to embarrass this family today. Stay in this car, Morgan." I stared at her in total disbelief. The woman who birthed me was more concerned about a photo opportunity with local politicians than letting me say goodbye to the only man who ever truly loved me. Before I could even form a response, my brother-in-law Trent stepped up right behind her. He adjusted his custom-tailored jacket with a highly smug smile. Trent always loved putting me in my place. He was a wealthy white private equity manager who reveled in reminding me how far I had fallen from my family's grace. He pulled a crisp $20 bill from his wallet and slipped it through the crack in the window, letting it flutter down onto my lap. "Buy yourself a coffee, kid," Trent said, his tone dripping with extreme condescension. "The adults are mourning. We will be back in a few hours. Try not to ruin the leather seats." My mother nodded in agreement, smoothing the front of her black designer dress. "Do not cause a scene, Morgan. We have a legacy to uphold today." They turned their backs and walked toward the grand entrance of the church, greeting a state senator with wide plastic smiles. They left me locked in a black car in 90-degree heat. The engine was off. The air conditioning was off. The isolation was truly suffocating, but the humiliation burned far worse than the rising temperature inside the vehicle. For 10 long years, this was my reality. Ever since I left my historically black college to build my own software company, I became the family pariah. They worshipped Sydney, my older sister, the flawless dermatologist with her perfect marriage to Trent. I was just the ugly dropout who could never do anything right. They had absolutely no idea that while they were busy maintaining their country club memberships and pretending to be sweet Auburn royalty, I had spent the last decade building a highly lucrative financial technology startup entirely in the shadows. I picked up the $20 bill Trent had thrown at me. A bitter laugh escaped my throat. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, trying to figure out how to manually override the door locks when my phone vibrated loudly in my purse. The caller ID showed Mr. Holloway. He was my grandfather Elias's personal attorney, a brilliant, no-nonsense black man who had managed my grandfather's real estate empire for 30 years. My grandfather had built his massive fortune from the ground up, acquiring historic commercial properties across Atlanta when nobody else saw their true value. He saw right through my parents' fake high society facade. He was my absolute rock. I swiped to answer the call. "Mr. Holloway, I am trapped in the parking lot. They locked me in the car." "I know, Morgan," Mr. Holloway said. His voice was incredibly calm, yet it carried a heavy weight that made me sit up straight. "Your grandfather warned me they would pull a stunt exactly like this. He knew Brenda and David would try to keep you away from the family and the press today." "I just wanted to say goodbye to him," I whispered, fighting back tears of intense frustration. Elias knew that Mr. Holloway replied smoothly. But he also told me that if they blocked you from the church, I was to enact protocol immediately. Listen to me very carefully, Morgan. I need you to skip the burial. Order a car and get to my office right now. Your office. Right now. The reading of the will is not until tomorrow. The reading for the family is tomorrow, Mr. Holloway corrected. The transfer of power happens today. Your grandfather left specific instructions for this exact moment. Get out of that car, Morgan. It is time to claim your empire. My heart hammered fiercely against my ribs. Claim my empire. The words hung in the heavy, stagnant air of the SUV. I dropped the phone back into my purse. The tears I had been holding back completely evaporated, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I was done crying over their cruelty. I was done being the family secret. I was done letting people who were actually drowning in secret debt treat me like a worthless peasant. I reached over the front seat, managed to hit the master unlock button on the driver's side console, and pushed the heavy door open. The thick, humid air of Atlanta hit my face like a physical wave, but I had never felt more alive. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the $20 bill Trent had so graciously donated to my existence, and lifted the windshield wiper of his luxury SUV. I pinned the $20 firmly under the blade right on the driver's side where Trent would definitely see it. I pulled out my phone and ordered a premium black town car. Within 4 minutes, a sleek vehicle pulled up beside me. I climbed into the beautifully air-conditioned back seat, smoothing out the minor wrinkles in my thrifted suit. Where to miss the driver asked politely. I gave him the address for Mr. Holloway's downtown law firm. I looked out the tinted window at the massive church where my family was busy performing their grief for the cameras, completely unaware of the massive storm that was about to hit them. I took one last look at the pristine building and smiled. This was the end of their reign. I was ready. They wanted to lock me out of the picture so they could control the narrative and keep their status intact. They had absolutely no idea that I was about to buy the entire frame. The ride to downtown Atlanta took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like stepping into an entirely different dimension. I walked into the prestigious law firm of Holloway and Associates. Mr. Holloway was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office overlooking the city. He turned around when I entered, his sharp eyes taking in my thrifted suit. He did not judge me. He simply smiled a proud, knowing smile, and pulled out the heavy leather chair at the head of the massive mahogany conference table. "Have a seat, Morgan," he said quietly. "Your grandfather wanted you exactly right there." I sat down, my hands trembling slightly against the polished wood. For years I had been pushed to the back of every room, hidden away, so my parents could pretend their perfect high-society family had no flaws. Now Elias had placed me at the absolute center of it all. We waited in silence. 45 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of the conference room swung open. My family strolled in, completely oblivious to my presence at first. The fake grief they had performed for the cameras outside the church had completely vanished. Instead, they were practically vibrating with greed. My mother Brenda was already wiping away invisible tears while simultaneously adjusting her diamond necklace. My father David patted his stomach, looking around the room like he already owned it. But it was my white brother-in-law Trent who was talking the loudest. "I am telling you, David," Trent said casually, pulling out a heavy leather chair for my sister Sydney. "We bulldoze those outdated brick buildings on Auburn Avenue by early next month. The Heritage Society will complain, but who cares? We can flip that land to my overseas developers for luxury condos and double the estate value before Christmas." Sydney laughed, fixing her perfect hair. Finally, she sighed. "Grandpa held on to those dusty restaurants way too long. It is time to bring this family into the 21st century." They were planning to destroy the very community my grandfather had spent his entire life building. Sweet Auburn was not just real estate. It was history. It was our legacy. And Trent, a man who married into our black family purely for access to our generational wealth, was ready to pave over it for a quick bonus. That is when my father turned toward the head of the table and finally noticed me. The color drained from his face. His jaw actually dropped. "Morgan," He barked, his voice echoing sharply against the glass walls. "What in the world are you doing here? I specifically told you to wait in the car. You are humiliating us in front of Mr. Holloway. Get out right now." My mother gasped, clutching her designer bag to her chest like I was a thief. "How did you even get here?" she demanded. "You are supposed to be out of sight. This is a private legal meeting for the heirs." Trent sneered, stepping toward me with that familiar look of absolute condescension. "Listen to your parents, Morgan. This is a private equity matter now. We are dealing with big boy assets, not whatever little gig you do on your laptop. Let me call security so we can get this over with." He actually reached for his phone. But before his thumb could tap the screen, a heavy wooden gavel slammed down on the table. The sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. Mr. Holloway stood up, his towering frame commanding instant respect. He adjusted his glasses and looked at my family with utter disgust. "Sit down and be quiet," Mr. Holloway ordered, his voice dangerously low. "Nobody is calling security on the primary beneficiary of this estate." My father choked on his own breath. "Primary what?" he stammered, exchanging a panicked look with my mother. Mr. Holloway ignored him, opening a thick, leather-bound folder. "We are here for the final reading of the last will and testament of Elias James. I suggest you all take a seat." My family slowly sank into their chairs, the smug confidence suddenly draining from their faces. Trent looked like he had swallowed a lemon, his eyes darting between me and the lawyer. "I, Elias James, being of sound mind, do hereby dictate the division of my earthly assets," Mr. Holloway began reading. "To my son David and my daughter-in-law Brenda, you have spent your lives chasing the approval of people who do not care about you. You have squandered your own resources to maintain an illusion of wealth. To ensure you do not starve, I leave you a locked trust. You will receive exactly $1,000 a month. You cannot touch the principal. You cannot borrow against it. It is locked indefinitely." My mother let out a strangled gasp. $1,000, she cried out. "That does not even cover the monthly dues at our country club." Mr. Holloway kept reading unbothered. "To my granddaughter Sydney, you have achieved great things in your medical career, but you have lost your soul in the process. You value designer labels more than your own sister. To you, I leave my collection of vintage family photo albums in the hopes you remember where you came from." Sydney turned sheet white. "Photo albums," she whispered, her voice trembling. "But Trent promised we were getting the commercial properties. We already took out a bridge loan against the inheritance." My ears perked up. They took out a loan against a dead man's money. Trent's face was rapidly turning a deep shade of crimson. He leaned over the table, glaring at Mr. Holloway. "Read the rest," Trent demanded. "Where are the voting shares for Elias Holdings?" Mr. Holloway turned the page, looking directly at me. "To my youngest granddaughter Morgan, they constantly called you a failure because you did not follow their incredibly shallow rules. But I saw you studying code late into the night. I saw you building your own software company from nothing. You have the grit and the vision that this family lacks. Therefore, I leave you 100% of the voting shares of Elias Holdings, including all commercial real estate in Sweet Auburn and the corporate parent company, valued at $45 million. The heavy silence in the room was absolute. It was so incredibly quiet that I could clearly hear the faint, steady hum of the air conditioning unit above us. $45 million. I owned everything. The buildings, the restaurants, the land Trent wanted to bulldoze. I was not just sitting at the head of the table. I owned the entire room. Suddenly, my mother's eyes rolled back in her head. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed entirely, hitting the expensive carpet with a heavy thud. She had literally fainted from the shock of losing her imaginary fortune. David scrambled out of his chair, dropping to his knees to shake her awake, his hands trembling uncontrollably. But Trent did not even bother to look down at my unconscious mother. He stared at me, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar. He slammed both of his fists onto the mahogany table so hard the water glasses shook. "This is a forgery!" Trent screamed, spit flying from his lips. There is absolutely no way that crazy old man left a $45 million empire to an uneducated dropout. She manipulated him. She took advantage of a dying man with dementia. I am certainly not letting some totally incompetent brat take what rightfully belongs to my family. I am calling the police and having this entire document thrown out right now. Trent did not step back from the table after Mr. Holloway finished speaking. Instead, he lunged forward until he was standing directly over my chair. He was a remarkably tall man who constantly used his physical size to deeply intimidate everyone around him. He clearly thought I would cower in fear, just like my parents always did whenever he raised his voice. He slammed his heavy palms onto the leather armrests of my chair, essentially trapping me in place. His angry face was so incredibly close to mine that I could actually smell the expensive scotch he must have been drinking before attending the solemn funeral service. "You think you have won something here, Morgan?" he asked, his voice dropping to a vicious whisper that echoed loudly in the silent room. "You think this ridiculous piece of paper means absolutely anything in the real world. You are nothing but a pathetic college dropout. You are an uneducated child who could not even handle getting a basic degree at a historically black college. You know absolutely nothing about managing commercial real estate. You know nothing about local zoning laws or asset management or high-level private equity. You certainly do not belong in this corporate boardroom, and you absolutely do not belong sitting at the head of this important table." I looked up at him without blinking a single time. My heart beat in a slow and steady rhythm. Mr. Holloway watched us carefully from his massive wooden desk, but he did not intervene. He knew exactly what I was capable of doing. My mother was still on the floor weeping loudly into her hands, while my father stood completely paralyzed by the large window. Sydney was clutching her vintage photo albums to her chest, like they were a physical shield, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. She could sense that the power dynamic had permanently shifted away from her perfect golden child status. "My firm manages the wealth for this entire family," Trent continued, his face turning an even deeper shade of red as his anger boiled over. "We handle the legal logistics for all Elias Holdings properties. If you think I am going to let a foolish girl who wears cheap clothes from a donation bin run these $45 million assets right into the ground, you are completely delusional. I will have my massive team of ruthless corporate lawyers draft a restrictive injunction by the end of the hour. We will officially challenge your grandfather's mental capacity in front of a judge. We will boldly claim you maliciously manipulated him in his final confusing days. We will legally freeze your access to every single bank account and historic property before the sun goes down today. You will definitely be back to working in a dark basement before the week is completely out." He sneered at me, pointing a thick finger directly at my face. "Keep your pathetic little document, Morgan. Within exactly 24 hours, that piece of trash will be as completely useless as your future." I slowly reached into my leather bag and smoothly pulled out my tablet. I placed it gently on the mahogany table. I did not break eye contact with Trent as I unlocked the bright screen. "You are definitely right about exactly one thing, Trent," I said, my voice perfectly calm and terrifyingly steady. "I did drop out of college. You all really loved calling me a massive failure for doing that. You thoroughly loved telling your elite country club friends that I was the ultimate family embarrassment. But I did not drop out because I could not handle the academic coursework. I dropped out because the coursework was moving much too slowly for the complex software I was actively building." Trent let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "Software? You literally mean those silly little video games you play on your cheap laptop? You are busy playing pretend in your bedroom while the real adults actually handle the real money in this powerful family." I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile that made his bitter laughter abruptly stop. "I currently build advanced financial technology software," I explained while slowly tapping a few quick buttons on my illuminated screen. "Specifically, I build artificial intelligence systems that are exclusively designed to track corporate embezzlement, illicit wire transfers, and hidden offshore accounts in absolute real time." Major global banks currently use my proprietary software to catch wealthy people who steal money from trusting clients. And since I exclusively owned the highly advanced tracking system, I decided to run a little beta test using the internal financial records of Elias Holdings. The room suddenly felt very cold. The smug, arrogant expression on Trent's face began to crack, replacing itself with a look of pure, dawning confusion. My father finally found his voice. "What on earth are you talking about, Morgan?" he demanded, stepping away from my weeping mother. I completely ignored my father and kept my sharp eyes locked firmly on my brother-in-law. "You talk a big game about asset management, Trent," I said softly. "You mean the same firm you used to quietly borrow $1.5 million from Grandpa's charity fund last year to cover your bad stock trades, Trent?" "Yes, I dropped out. I dropped out to build a fintech software that tracks corporate embezzlement. And I have been tracking you." Trent froze completely. His heavy hands slowly slipped off the leather armrests of my chair, and he took a staggering step backward. His pale blue eyes widened in absolute terror. "You selfishly siphoned money meant for local community center renovations. You foolishly thought you could hide it securely by bouncing funds through 4 dummy corporations. You thought my grandfather was just a confused old man." I tapped my tablet. A notification chimed loudly on Trent's phone. He looked down in total horror. I smiled at him. "I just froze your company credit cards. All of them." The aftermath of the boardroom confrontation left a lingering tension in the air, but I knew my family would not simply surrender and go away quietly. The very next morning, I was sitting at the small quartz island in my modest apartment, sipping a cup of black coffee and reviewing the financial logs from Elias Holdings. The sun had barely risen over the Atlanta skyline when the aggressive pounding on my front door began. It was not a normal knock. It was a furious, entitled hammering that rattled the doorframe. I did not even have to look through the peephole to know exactly who it was. I calmly set my coffee mug down and unlocked the deadbolt. Before I could even pull the door fully open, my father David shoved his way inside, with my mother Brenda right on his heels. They looked completely unhinged. My father's face was flushed a deep, angry red, and his breathing was heavy while my mother clutched her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. The polished, high society facade they had displayed at the funeral was completely gone, replaced by raw, desperate panic. David did not even bother to greet me. He pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and started shouting right there in my entryway. "You are going to fix this right now, Morgan," he yelled, his voice echoing off the walls of my small living room. "Trent has been locked out of his own corporate accounts, and his firm is threatening an internal audit because of whatever hacking stunt you pulled yesterday. You are actively destroying your sister's marriage, and you are publicly humiliating this family." I just stood there leaning casually against the kitchen counter and watched them unravel. Brenda stepped forward, trying to use her old tactics of emotional manipulation. She squeezed her eyes shut, forcing out a few fake tears that perfectly mirrored the performance she gave at the church. "Morgan, baby, please," she whimpered, stepping closer but carefully avoiding any actual physical contact with me. "We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you everything. You cannot just steal your grandfather's legacy and use it to ruin us. We are your own flesh and blood. How can you be so incredibly selfish after everything we have sacrificed for you?" I let out a short, bitter laugh that echoed in the quiet space. "Selfish?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously even. "You want to talk about being selfish while you stand in my home, demanding I hand over a $45 million empire so you can continue to pretend you are wealthy?" David slammed his hand down on the edge of my kitchen counter. "Do not take that disrespectful tone with your mother," he barked, stepping into my personal space, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me, just like Trent had tried to do the day before. "I am completely done playing these stupid games with you, Morgan. You are going to call Holloway right now, and you are going to sign every single one of those voting shares back over to me where they belong. You owe us your absolute loyalty. We put clothes on your back, we fed you. We are the only reason you have a place to sleep at night. He looked around my modestly decorated apartment with a look of absolute disgust on his face. Look at this place, he sneered. You live like a peasant. We pay for this very roof over your head, Morgan. I set up that direct deposit allowance for you years ago because you could not even hold down a proper job. You rely on our charity to survive. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to sign those properties back to the family right now, or I am calling your landlord and cutting off your rent money. You will be homeless and living on the streets of Atlanta by noon. You will have absolutely nothing. The sheer audacity of his threat hung in the heavy morning air. He actually believed he held my survival in his hands. He actually thought that tiny allowance he sent to a dead bank account was keeping me alive. I looked at my father and felt a deep, overwhelming sense of pity mixed with utter disdain. I did not scream or shout. I simply laughed. It was a cold, hollow sound that made both of my parents freeze in their tracks. You paid for nothing, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper that commanded total attention. You pay for absolutely nothing, Dad. I watched the confusion slowly spread across their faces as I walked around the kitchen island to face them directly. 10 years ago, I was sitting in the financial aid office at Spelman College, terrified and crying, because the administration told me my tuition check had bounced. I called you Dad. I called you begging for help because I was about to be kicked out of my classes. Do you remember what you told me? David swallowed hard and took a tiny step backward, his confident posture slightly deflating. I told him exactly what happened. You told me that the family budget was tight. But the truth was, you had stopped paying my tuition entirely so you could fund Sydney's lavish destination wedding in Lake Como. You paid for imported ice sculptures and custom floral arrangements while I was literally packing my entire dorm room into black garbage bags. I was evicted because of you. You chose her perfect wedding photos over my education. Brenda opened her mouth to make another excuse, but I held up my hand to silence her. So do not ever stand in my home and tell me you put a roof over my head. I continued my words, hitting them like physical blows. You abandoned me. But what you did not know is that getting evicted was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to build my software company. It forced me to make my own millions while you were busy drowning in country club debt. I gestured around the modest walls of the apartment. You think you can threaten to call my landlord Dad? Go ahead and try. You cannot call my landlord because I bought this entire apartment building 3 years ago. I purchased it through a blind LLC. I own every single unit in this complex. You do not own my roof, Dad, but I own yours. David stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to comprehend the reality of my words. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a trap door and the lever had already been pulled. You are lying, he whispered weakly, shaking his head. You do not have that kind of money. I turned to the stack of mail on my kitchen counter and picked up a heavy manila envelope that Mr. Holloway had prepared for me late last night. I pulled out a thick stack of legal documents printed on crisp white paper. I walked over to my father and shoved the documents directly into his trembling hands. I am not lying, Dad, I said softly, watching the color drain completely from his face as his eyes scanned the bold black letters at the top of the page. My grandfather's holding company technically owned the land your massive house sits on, and since you have not paid property taxes or the massive secondary mortgage in over 6 months, the estate has officially called in the debt. I smiled at him, a cold, unforgiving smile. That is a foreclosure notice for your sprawling Atlanta mansion. Your rent is officially overdue. David stared at the foreclosure notice in his trembling hands, unable to form a single coherent word, while my mother collapsed against the granite island, weeping uncontrollably. I quietly opened the front door and waited for them to leave. They stumbled out of my apartment looking like hollow shells of the arrogant people who had barged in just 20 minutes earlier. I closed the door behind them and locked the deadbolt, feeling a profound sense of closure as their footsteps faded down the hallway. The very next morning, I was sitting in my corner office at the downtown headquarters of my fintech company. The glass walls overlooked the bustling Atlanta traffic, but my focus was entirely on the scrolling data feeds across my multiple monitors. My company had grown from a tiny bedroom project into a massive firm that monitored global transactions, and my workspace heavily reflected that hard-earned success. It was sleek and modern, with polished concrete floors and minimalist furniture that commanded quiet authority. The receptionist had buzzed me moments earlier to say I had an unannounced visitor who was actively refusing to wait in the lobby area. Before I could even ask for a name over the intercom, the heavy glass door of my office swung open with aggressive force. Sydney stood in the doorway looking completely disheveled and frantic. This was a woman who usually never left her house without a perfect blowout and flawless designer makeup. Today, her hair was pulled into a messy knot, and her expensive mascara was streaked with fresh tears. She rushed into my office, ignoring my assistant who was hovering anxiously in the hallway. I waved my assistant away and the door clicked shut, leaving just the two of us in the quiet room. Sydney dramatically threw herself into the leather guest chair opposite my desk, burying her face in her hands and letting out a loud, tragic sob. "Morgan, you have to stop this!" she cried loudly, her voice echoing against the glass walls. "Trent is completely falling apart, and I do not know what to do anymore." He was up all night pacing the hardwood floors and screaming at his corporate lawyers on the phone. His own partners are launching an internal investigation because of the sudden freeze on his accounts. He cannot access his company cards, and his personal assets are entirely locked down. "You are absolutely destroying my marriage and ruining our entire lives over some petty family grudge." I sat perfectly still watching her perform. It was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. She looked up at me with large, wet eyes, playing the ultimate victim perfectly. "We are blood, Morgan," she cried, leaning over my large desk and reaching desperately for my hand. "I am your big sister, and we are supposed to take care of each other. We grew up together in the same house. How can you be so incredibly selfish and vindictive after everything we have shared? Grandpa would be sick to his stomach if he saw what you were doing to our family right now. He wanted us to be united, and you are tearing us apart for absolutely no reason." I calmly pulled my hand away from her grasping fingers and turned back to my computer screens. My pulse remained steady as my fingers moved rapidly across the quiet keyboard, pulling up a specific archived file from 5 years ago. I dragged the window over and turned one of my large monitors so it faced her directly. "Selfish?" I asked, keeping my tone completely flat and detached. "You have a tremendous amount of nerve using that specific word in this office, Sydney. Do you remember the $50,000 Grandpa gave us 5 years ago? He specifically earmarked that money for us to start a joint health and wellness application. It was supposed to be our ultimate sisterly bonding project and my very first real software coding job." Sydney stopped crying for a fraction of a second. Her breath hitched in her throat and her tear-filled eyes darted to the glowing monitor. The file I had opened displayed a crystal-clear trail of wire transfers and bank statements highlighted in bright yellow. I continued speaking while she stared at the undeniable proof of her ultimate betrayal. "You told Grandpa the external app developers needed the funds immediately to secure the server space. But you never paid any developers, Sydney. You bounced the funds through a shell company registered in Delaware, just to make the paper trail look like a legitimate vendor payment. Then you secretly wired that entire $50,000 into a private offshore account and funneled it right back into the city to use as the down payment for your luxury dermatology clinic in Buckhead. You left me with absolutely nothing to build the application with." I leaned forward, resting my arms on the polished wood of my desk. "And when the project inevitably failed because there was absolutely no funding, you sat at the Thanksgiving dinner table and told the entire family that I was simply too lazy to finish the code. You let Mom and Dad call me a worthless, uneducated failure while you quietly opened your beautiful new clinic. I took the blame for your financial theft for 5 whole years because I actually thought keeping the peace was more important than exposing my own big sister to a fragile old man. You stole my first major opportunity and used it to build your own medical empire while leaving me to absorb all the family shame and ridicule. The heavy silence that followed was completely suffocating. The fake tears instantly dried on Sydney's face. The pathetic, helpless victim act vanished completely as if a switch had been flipped deep in her brain. Her posture straightened automatically, and the warm, pleading look in her eyes turned into a mask of pure, cold hatred. The sisterly love she had just tried to fake was replaced by a familiar, ruthless arrogance that mirrored her husband perfectly. "You are a complete sociopath," she hissed, her voice dropping to a dangerous, unfeeling whisper. "You have just been sitting in the dark hoarding these pathetic little secrets for years, just waiting for the perfect moment to destroy us all." She stood up slowly, smoothing out the wrinkles in her expensive coat with trembling fingers. "But you are not nearly as smart as you think you are. Morgan, you might have the bank accounts locked right now, and you might think you hold all the cards, but Trent is going to completely ruin you. He is not going to just roll over and let a dropout take his power and his money. He has a secret proxy clause from Grandpa's original board of directors. It is a legal loophole you know absolutely nothing about, and he is going to use it to legally strip you of every single thing you think you own." Sydney spun on her expensive heels and stormed out of my office, leaving her venomous threat hanging in the chilled air. I did not let her words shake me. I had built my entire company by anticipating every possible move a desperate person might make. If Trent wanted to play his final hand using my grandfather's old board of directors, I was more than ready to call his bluff. I spent the rest of the day fortifying my legal positions and confirming my own carefully arranged meetings. I knew exactly who these men were. They were relics of a bygone era, men who only cared about their own comfort and their quarterly dividends. Trent thought he could use their outdated loyalties to crush me, but he had no idea what kind of chessboard we were actually playing on. Less than 48 hours later, I walked into the primary executive boardroom on the top floor of Elias Holdings. The room was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling Atlanta skyline. But the air inside was thick and suffocating. It smelled heavily of stale, expensive cologne and pure, unadulterated entitlement. Trent had wasted absolutely no time. He sat casually at the very head of the long, frosted glass table, acting as if he had already claimed the throne. He was flanked by 5 older men in bespoke suits. I recognized them immediately. They were my father's longtime golfing buddies and the original board members my grandfather had retained out of sheer, stubborn loyalty. Arthur Richard William and the rest of the old guard. They had spent decades nodding along to whatever my family wanted as long as their dividend checks cleared on time. Now they were looking at me with thinly veiled amusement and utter condescension. "Well," Morgan Trent said loudly, leaning back in his heavy leather chair and tenting his fingers together. "I am so glad you could join us today for your final afternoon at the office." He gestured grandly around the table as if presenting a winning lottery ticket. "I convened this emergency board meeting using the proxy clause grandfather established decades ago. It allows the active board to override a majority shareholder if that shareholder proves to be a direct and immediate threat to the financial stability of the company. And let us be perfectly honest here with each other. An uneducated dropout who thinks she can suddenly run a $45 million real estate empire is the absolute definition of a financial threat. You are a liability, Morgan, and we are here to surgically remove you." The old men chuckled softly, shaking their gray heads in unison. Arthur adjusted his expensive reading glasses and looked down his nose at me with a sickening smile. "Nothing personal." Little Lady Arthur patronized smoothly, leaning his elbows onto the glass surface. "But commercial real estate is an incredibly complex beast. It is a man's game. We cannot possibly risk the precious Elias legacy on a young girl who lacks a formal college degree and any proper corporate training. You surely understand our position. We are simply protecting your grandfather's life work from your inevitable mistakes. You should be thanking us for taking this massive burden off your little shoulders. I did not say a single word. I stood quietly at the opposite end of the long glass table, holding my digital tablet closely against my side, and watched them revel in their imaginary victory. Trent stood up slowly, smoothing the lapels of his tailored suit with a triumphant, deeply arrogant smirk. He pressed a small button on a remote control, and the large presentation screen behind him illuminated instantly. It displayed a massive commercial development proposal filled with architectural renderings of sleek, soulless high-rises. To ensure the continued prosperity of Elias Holdings, Trent announced, his voice booming with absolute unearned authority. I am introducing an immediate motion to liquidate the Sweet Auburn historic properties. I have spent the last 6 grueling months secretly negotiating a highly lucrative buyout with a massive foreign development group based out of Dubai. They are incredibly eager. They are ready to wire the funds by Friday afternoon. They will bulldoze those worthless, dusty old brick buildings and erect a modern commercial plaza that will generate unprecedented revenue. This spectacular deal will double our quarterly projections and completely stabilize the company portfolio against any of Morgan's previous incompetence. The board members murmured their absolute approval, nodding enthusiastically at the staggering financial numbers displayed on the glowing screen. Trent looked directly at me, his eyes practically glowing with malice and unrestrained greed. Not only does this brilliant move save the company Morgan, but my firm will naturally secure a generous 10% broker fee for arranging the complex acquisition. It is a brilliant win for everyone who actually matters. I get my money, the board gets their dividends, and you get to go back to being entirely insignificant. Trent placed both hands firmly on the table and leaned forward, his eyes locked on mine. So let us make this extremely official right now. I call for an immediate vote of no confidence to officially oust Morgan as the Chief Executive Officer of Elias Holdings, and a secondary vote to fully approve the liquidation sale to the Dubai developers. All those in favor, please raise your hands, please. Every single old man around the table confidently raised his right hand into the air. They were smiling warmly, talking amongst themselves, already treating me like a ghost who had just been forcefully evicted from the room. Trent looked at me, expecting me to scream or cry or beg for mercy, just like my parents had done in my living room. He wanted a dramatic, emotional reaction. He desperately wanted to break my spirit in front of his audience. Well, Morgan, Trent mocked, gesturing wildly toward my empty hands. Are you not going to vote to try and save yourself? I remained perfectly still. I did not break eye contact with him as a slow, terrifying smile finally spread across my face. I do not need to vote, Trent, I said, my voice cutting through their arrogant laughter like a sharpened blade. I reached out and tapped a single button on my tablet screen. A soft electronic chime echoed heavily from the boardroom speakers, and the heavy double doors at the far end of the room instantly swung wide open. 3 tall, impeccably dressed men strode into the boardroom carrying expensive leather briefcases. They exuded absolute power and quiet, unshakable authority. The entire room fell dead silent. Trent froze completely, his hand still raised awkwardly in the air for his imaginary vote. The foreign developers walked right past the stunned old board members, right past my confused brother-in-law, and came directly to my end of the table. The lead developer, a sharp-featured man with piercing dark eyes, extended his hand toward me. I shook it firmly. He then turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward Trent, whose face had instantly drained of all human color. "We do not deal with middlemen," the developer stated, his voice carrying a heavy, flawless accent that commanded total, absolute silence in the room. "We only work with the owner. Mr. Trent, you are fired as the broker." Trent stood completely paralyzed as the lead developer delivered the crushing blow. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. The 5 older board members sitting around the frosted glass table suddenly looked incredibly fragile as their smug confidence evaporated into the stale boardroom air. The lead developer nodded respectfully to me, and I calmly instructed my private security team to escort my former brother-in-law and his wealthy golfing buddies out of the building. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched from above as Trent stumbled out onto the pavement completely stripped of his unearned power and his lucrative brokerage fee. The victory was absolute and undeniable, but I knew my family was like a pack of cornered animals, and they would not simply walk away quietly after being so thoroughly humiliated in front of the people they respected most. I was right to be cautious, because less than 24 hours later, my mother decided to go completely nuclear. Since they could not beat me in a boardroom or a courtroom, Brenda took the battle directly to the court of public opinion. She set up her smartphone in the lavish living room of her foreclosed mansion and went live on social media to execute the most desperate smear campaign I had ever witnessed. She weaponized her high society connections, sending out massive group texts to the country club elite and the wealthy charity board members she had spent decades currying favor with. I sat in my office and watched the video feed with a mixture of absolute disgust and dark fascination. Brenda was putting on the performance of a lifetime. She was wearing a simple black dress with no makeup, and her hair was intentionally messy. She cried authentic-looking tears as she stared directly into the camera lens, playing the ultimate victim. She told her thousands of wealthy followers a completely fabricated story about how I had secretly moved back to Atlanta to prey on my vulnerable dying grandfather. She sobbed heavily as she spun a web of horrific lies, claiming I had isolated him in his final months and used my advanced technology background to commit severe financial elder abuse. She told the world that I had forcefully coerced a confused old man to sign away the family legacy and completely cut out the people who truly loved and cared for him. She begged her friends to share the video, claiming she was just a heartbroken mother trying to protect her family from a sociopathic, estranged daughter who was driven entirely by greed. The vicious smear campaign spread like absolute wildfire across the internet within a matter of minutes. High society housewives and local influencers love a good scandal, and they shared Brenda's tearful video tens of thousands of times before the afternoon was over. The digital mob was completely merciless, and they quickly discovered the name and details of my independent fintech company. By the early evening, my financial software application was being absolutely bombarded with thousands of one-star reviews. People who had never even downloaded my platform were leaving hateful comments calling me a thief, a monster, and an elder abuser. The pristine corporate reputation I had spent 5 agonizing years building from scratch was being violently torn apart by an army of angry strangers who believed my mother's theatrical tears without a second thought. My customer service lines were completely jammed with panicked people demanding to cancel their accounts, and my server teams were working overtime just to handle the flood of negative traffic. The rapid escalation of the public relations crisis caused a massive wave of panic among my primary venture capital investors. My private office phone began ringing constantly, with anxious billionaires and board members wondering if this viral nightmare was going to permanently tank their massive financial investments in my company. I spent hours calmly pacing the concrete floors of my suite, reassuring them that the situation was under control, but the corporate tension was undeniably real and incredibly dangerous. Later that evening, I was standing alone in my dimly lit executive suite, looking down at the heavy Atlanta traffic below, when my heavy glass doors suddenly swung open. David walked in, looking incredibly smug and completely revitalized by the chaos he had unleashed. He had watched the digital destruction unfold all day, and he genuinely believed they had finally broken me. He casually strolled over to my desk, acting like he owned the entire building, and poured himself a tall glass of expensive bourbon from my private bar cart. He took a long, slow sip of the amber liquid and smiled at me with pure predatory confidence. "Well, Morgan," he said, shaking his head in fake, exaggerated sympathy, It really is an absolute shame to see your little tech startup drowning like this in front of the whole world. The internet is a very unforgiving place, especially when a respected, grieving mother cries out for help. But we are not monsters, Morgan, and we are still your parents. We are entirely willing to throw you a life preserver before your entire software company goes completely bankrupt and you lose everything you built. Here is the deal, and it is the only one you are going to get. You will sign over 70% of Grandpa's estate to me and your mother right now, and we will publicly clear your name. Brenda will go back online tomorrow morning and tell everyone it was just a terrible family misunderstanding, and your precious little business can survive this storm. I looked at the arrogant smirk on his aging face and felt absolutely nothing but cold, unwavering focus. "Keep talking, Dad," I said softly, keeping my eyes perfectly locked on his. I slowly raised my hand and pointed directly to the dark corner of my expansive office. A renowned investigative journalist from a major national news network stepped out from the deep shadows. She was holding a professional audio recorder with a bright red light glowing in the darkness, capturing every single word of his blatant extortion attempt. The color completely drained from my father's face as the investigative journalist stepped forward from the shadows and politely asked him if he would like to provide an official comment on the extortion demands he had just made on tape. He stammered out a pathetic, incoherent excuse and literally ran out of my office, leaving his drink half finished on my desk. The smear campaign was dead in the water, and my mother would soon have to face the absolute public ruin she had just brought upon herself. But the war was not entirely over yet, because Trent was not a man who surrendered easily or gracefully. Less than 2 hours later, the heavy oak doors of my legal counsel Mr. Holloway's office burst open with violent force. I was sitting across from my lawyer finalizing the estate transfers when Trent marched into the room acting as if his aggressive entitlement could somehow reverse reality. He looked around the dignified office with a sneer of pure aristocratic disdain. Trent was wearing a bespoke navy suit that cost more than a car, and he leaned his tall frame against the polished mahogany desk, trying to physically tower over the older man sitting behind it. He was entirely desperate, but he was still trying to use every single ounce of his status as a wealthy white finance executive to intimidate an older distinguished black attorney who had been practicing corporate law since before Trent was even born. "You two absolutely manipulated a senile old man," Trent spat, his voice dripping with condescension and venom as he slammed his hands down on the desk. "You took advantage of a fragile, declining mind to steal my wife's rightful inheritance and hand it over to a bitter dropout. I know exactly how you people operate, Holloway. I have powerful friends on the State Bar Association, and I am going to make it my personal mission to have you completely disbarred. You are going to lose your license and your entire practice, and you, Morgan, are going to federal prison for elder abuse and corporate fraud." Mr. Holloway did not flinch. He did not raise his voice or show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. He simply looked at Trent with the calm, mild exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire life dealing with arrogant bullies who thought their bank accounts made them invincible. Mr. Holloway slowly reached into his desk drawer, adjusted his reading glasses, and slid a small silver USB drive across the smooth surface of the wood until it stopped right in front of Trent's perfectly manicured hand. I stood up from my leather chair and walked around to face my arrogant brother-in-law. "You see, Trent?" I said, keeping my voice dangerously calm and watching his eyes dart toward the silver drive. "You were so incredibly busy plotting to steal my grandfather's properties that you forgot what my company actually does for a living. You forgot who actually monitors and audits the complex financial software that your firm uses every single day to manage your vast portfolios." I watched his smug expression falter slightly as a tiny bead of sweat formed at his hairline. "When I locked down your corporate accounts yesterday, I did not just freeze your assets, Trent," I explained, stepping closer to him so he could hear the absolute finality in my tone. "I ran a comprehensive algorithmic sweep of your entire ledger history going back 5 years. My software is specifically designed to find anomalies and shadow transactions, and it found an absolute mountain of them hiding in your personal files. It turns out that for the last 4 years, you have been using the Sweet Auburn historic properties to actively launder millions of dollars for your extremely shady overseas clients. Trent tried to swallow, but his throat seemed to have completely closed up. He took a small step backward away from the USB drive as if it were a venomous snake. His pristine corporate mask was melting right off his face, revealing the terrified little boy hiding underneath. You were illegally funneling dirty money through fake renovation invoices and dummy contractor accounts attached directly to Elias Holdings? I continued, making sure my words hit him like physical blows. You created phantom companies to charge my grandfather's estate for complex construction work that never actually happened, and then you routed clean money back to your foreign investors through shell corporations in the Cayman Islands. That is the real reason you were so desperate to force a liquidation sale to that specific developer from Dubai. You desperately needed to bury the massive paper trail and wipe the local servers clean before the board of directors ever woke up and found out you were using the family business as a criminal laundromat. You are lying, Trent gasped, shaking his head in frantic denial. But his voice had lost all of its booming authority. It was thin and reedy and terrified. You cannot prove any of that. Morgan, you are just making up insane accusations to cover your own theft. You fabricated this data to ruin me, and I will sue you for everything you have. I did not argue with him. I did not even bother to raise my voice. I simply looked down at my wrist and slowly tapped the glass face of my watch. My timing was absolutely perfect. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division just received the fully decrypted contents of that file exactly 5 minutes ago, I said, watching his knees physically buckle as the reality of his total destruction finally set in. They have the fake invoices, they have the offshore routing numbers, and they have every single hidden email you sent to Dubai trying to cover your tracks. You really do not need to worry about my lawyer's license, Trent. You need to find yourself a very good criminal defense attorney. The news of Trent's impending federal indictment had not yet reached the glossy pages of the Atlanta Society papers, but the desperate, frantic energy radiating from my parents was palpable. Despite their sprawling mansion being in active foreclosure, and my father fleeing my office in sheer terror just days earlier, they somehow convinced themselves that maintaining their public facade was the only way to survive. They poured whatever remaining credit they had left into hosting their annual Elias Legacy Gala at the prestigious Buckhead Country Club. It was a lavish black-tie charity event that my grandfather had started decades ago to fund local community centers. But my mother had long since hijacked it to serve as a glamorous networking party for her elite social circle. I arrived at the country club just as the valet line was filling up with imported sports cars and luxury sedans. The evening air was warm and heavy with the scent of expensive floral arrangements that spilled out from the grand entrance. I was not wearing one of the stiff, uncomfortable ball gowns that my mother always forced me into when I was younger. Instead, I wore a sharp, tailored midnight blue suit that commanded the exact kind of quiet authority I had earned. The heavy mahogany doors were held open by staff in crisp white uniforms, and I stepped into the massive ballroom. It was a sea of glittering diamonds, sparkling champagne flutes, and the hollow, echoing laughter of people who only cared about their own bank accounts. At the center of the room, beneath a massive crystal chandelier, stood David and Brenda. They were holding court surrounded by local politicians and wealthy real estate developers. My mother was wearing a diamond necklace that I knew for a fact was currently being used as collateral for a high-interest bridge loan she had taken out last month. She was laughing loudly, tossing her head back and sipping her champagne, while my father patted a state senator's shoulder, playing the role of the generous billionaire philanthropist to absolute perfection. They were pretending they still controlled the $45 million Elias empire. They were putting on a desperate charade, hoping that if they just looked wealthy enough, the very real nightmare closing in around them would simply vanish. I walked slowly across the polished marble floor, letting my presence gently disrupt the atmosphere. The older board members who had been in Mr. Holloway's office when Trent was destroyed were standing near the bar. The moment they saw me, they immediately turned pale and quickly shuffled away, disappearing into the crowd like frightened mice. My mother was in the middle of a grand story about her upcoming summer plans when her eyes finally landed on me. The fake smile froze instantly on her perfectly contoured face. Her champagne flute trembled slightly, spilling a few drops of expensive wine onto the polished floor. She whispered something harsh to my father, who turned around and looked at me as if he had just seen a ghost. David swallowed hard, pulling at the collar of his tuxedo. But Brenda was already moving. She marched across the ballroom floor, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the marble. Her face was flushed with a mixture of absolute panic and raw, unfiltered rage. She intercepted me near the ice sculpture display, completely abandoning her refined high society persona. "What are you doing here, Morgan?" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper meant to stay below the gentle hum of the string quartet playing in the corner. "You have absolutely no right to show your face in this room after what you did to your father and your sister. Trent is facing federal charges because of your sick little vendetta, and you have the audacity to walk into my charity gala and ruin this evening for us." I looked at her, taking in the desperate, panicked breaths lifting her chest. "This is Grandpa's charity gala, Brenda," I replied, keeping my voice completely even and calm. "He started this foundation to help the community, not to fund your country club bar tab. I am here to ensure the legacy funds are actually distributed to the people who need them and not funneled into your personal accounts to save your foreclosed house." Brenda's eyes widened in pure terror as a few nearby guests turned their heads to listen to our conversation. She realized she was losing control of her precious narrative in front of the very people she was trying to impress. She frantically flagged down a passing event manager and pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. "Get security over here immediately," she demanded, her voice rising in pitch and echoing slightly over the music. "This woman is an uninvited guest. She is a college dropout who has been terrorizing my family, and she is completely trespassing on a private event. I am a platinum tier member of this establishment, and I want her physically removed from the premises right this second." The event manager looked incredibly uncomfortable, but gestured toward the grand entrance where the head of club security was already walking in our direction. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man named Marcus, who had worked at the Buckhead Country Club for over 15 years. My mother crossed her arms over her chest and lifted her chin, looking at me with a triumphant, vindictive sneer. She truly believed that within these exclusive walls her status was absolute and undeniable. She believed she could just snap her fingers and have me thrown out into the street like trash. Marcus approached our small group and politely cleared his throat. Brenda immediately turned to him with a look of severe entitlement. "Marcus, thank God you are here," she said loudly, making sure the surrounding guests could hear her asserting her authority. "Please escort this woman out of the building immediately. She is an uninvited guest, a college dropout, and she is harassing my friends." Marcus did not move toward me. He did not even look at me. Instead, he stopped directly in front of my mother and clasped his hands professionally in front of him. He looked at Brenda with an expression of polite, unwavering pity that made my father take a nervous step backward. "I am very sorry, Mom," Marcus said, his deep voice carrying perfectly across the suddenly quiet room. "But I cannot do that. Miss Morgan is not an uninvited guest. She actually finalized the paperwork and purchased this entire country club and its surrounding golf courses completely in cash yesterday afternoon." He paused, adjusting his radio earpiece slightly before delivering the final unchangeable truth directly to her face. "She is the sole owner of this property, Mom, and according to my files, you and your husband are the ones who have not paid your membership dues in over 6 months. Brenda stood frozen in absolute terror as Marcus, the head of security, delivered the final crushing blow to her fragile ego. The surrounding guests, who had eagerly leaned in to watch a dramatic high society eviction, were now staring at my mother with wide eyes and open mouths. The silence in our immediate circle was so heavy, it felt suffocating. My father, David, actually stumbled backward, bumping into a waiter who was carrying a tray of champagne flutes, causing the crystal glasses to rattle loudly in the quiet room. Brenda's face went from a furious flushed red to a sickly pale white in a matter of seconds. She opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to deny everything, but the truth was absolutely undeniable and she knew it. I did not wait for her to recover from the shock. I simply stepped around her perfectly manicured frozen form and began walking deliberately toward the grand stage at the front of the ballroom. The string quartet was still playing a soft classical melody, but the music seemed to fade away as I climbed the few carpeted steps to the main podium. This was the exact spot where my grandfather used to stand every single year to thank his generous friends for supporting the community. Now it was just another stage for my parents to perform their pathetic, wealthy charade. I stepped up to the sleek microphone stand and gently tapped the microphone twice. The soft, rhythmic thumping echoed through the massive ballroom, and the string quartet immediately stopped playing. Hundreds of wealthy guests, politicians, and real estate tycoons turned their attention toward the stage, expecting the usual opening remarks for the annual Legacy Gala. I stood perfectly straight, smoothing the lapels of my midnight blue suit, and looked out over the sea of glittering diamonds and tailored tuxedos. My voice was icy smooth and incredibly professional as it echoed through the speakers. "Good evening, everyone," I said, making sure my gaze swept across the entire room before locking directly onto the panicked faces of my parents. "Welcome to the annual Elias Legacy Gala. I know many of you are accustomed to seeing my grandfather standing here, or more recently, my parents David and Brenda. For those who do not know me, my name is Morgan Elias, and I am the Chief Executive Officer of Elias Holdings." A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the elite crowd. They had spent the last 48 hours reading my mother's viral social media posts, calling me a monster and an elder abuser. But here I was standing before them with absolute, unshakable authority. I did not let the whispers distract me. My grandfather started this foundation 30 years ago to build community centers and fund after-school programs in underserved neighborhoods. I continued, my voice completely devoid of any screaming or dramatic emotion. He believed that those of us who have been blessed with extreme wealth have a fundamental duty to lift up the people around us. You are all here tonight because you believe you are honoring that exact same legacy by writing massive checks to this foundation. I paused for a fraction of a second, letting the weight of my words settle over the wealthy audience. Brenda was aggressively pushing her way through the crowd, trying to get closer to the stage, but her heavy gown was slowing her down. "Unfortunately," I said, my tone dropping to a chillingly serious register, "the legacy you are funding tonight is a complete and absolute lie." Gasps echoed from the front rows. I pulled my digital tablet from my inner suit pocket and tapped a single button. The massive digital projection screens behind the stage that usually displayed photos of smiling children were suddenly filled with complex financial bank statements and heavily redacted wire transfers. Over the past 3 years since my grandfather fell ill, not a single dime of the millions of dollars raised in this room has gone to a community center, I announced, watching the horror spread across the faces of the generous donors. Every single donation, every charitable tax write-off, and every silent auction bid has been illegally funneled directly into the private offshore bank accounts of David and Brenda Elias. The wealthy crowd erupted into angry, shocked whispers. Politicians who had endorsed the charity were instantly backing away from my parents as if they were suddenly contagious. My father was shaking his head frantically, trying to deny the massive, glowing financial documents projected behind me, but the proof was absolute and completely undeniable. "You have been funding their country club dues, their luxury vacations, and their designer wardrobes," I stated, letting the icy truth cut through their glamorous illusion. "They have been using my grandfather's noble legacy to desperately prop up a bankrupt lifestyle they can no longer afford on their own." I looked directly at my mother, who was now standing near the edge of the stage, trembling with a mixture of absolute fury and undeniable humiliation. My parents call me a failure because I did not marry a doctor or a banker. I said, my voice echoing clearly over the rising anger of the betrayed crowd. They spent this entire week publicly trying to destroy my reputation and my company to hide their own crimes. But the truth is, I am the one who quietly bought up their massive debts. I am the one paying the mortgage on the house they sleep in. The elite guests were openly glaring at my parents, now their sympathetic smiles entirely replaced by absolute disgust. I looked down at Brenda and David with nothing but pure cold finality. And tonight, the free ride ends, I said softly but forcefully. You do not own this charity, you do not own this country club, and as of this morning, you no longer own that house. The ballroom descended into total chaotic uproar as the wealthy donors realized they had been completely scammed by the people they thought were their friends. Suddenly, my sister Sydney pushed her way violently through the crowd. Her face was contorted in pure, unhinged rage, and she scrambled up the stage steps, her expensive heels catching on the carpet. "You little liar!" she screamed frantically, lunging forward to grab the microphone from my hands, trying to stop the presentation. But just as her fingers grazed the metal stand, the heavy sound of blaring police sirens pierced through the night air. The loud wailing grew closer and closer, rapidly approaching the front entrance of the luxury venue. The piercing wail of the police sirens shattered the heavy silence of the ballroom, vibrating against the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The flashing red and blue lights painted the country club walls in a chaotic strobe effect, completely washing out the warm golden glow of the crystal chandeliers overhead. Sydney froze instantly, her outstretched hand hovering just inches from the microphone stand. Her face contorted in a mask of pure confusion. The wealthy guests murmured in panicked whispers, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive tailored suits and designer gowns as the heavy mahogany doors of the grand entrance were forcefully pushed open. Half a dozen police officers strode into the elegant room, led by a stern-looking federal detective in a dark trench coat. Their heavy tactical boots thudded against the polished marble floor, a harsh and completely foreign sound, in a room built for string quartets and polite society laughter. They moved with absolute purpose, their faces completely devoid of any emotion. The elite crowd parted for them, like the Red Sea, terrified of being associated with whatever scandal was about to unfold. My mother, Brenda, immediately let out a massive theatrical sigh of relief. She smoothed down the front of her expensive dress and pasted that sickeningly sweet high society smile back onto her face. She genuinely believed that her frantic demands to the event manager had actually worked. "Officer, thank God you are here," she announced loudly, stepping directly into the path of the lead detective and pointing a perfectly manicured finger straight at me. "This woman is trespassing on a private charity event. She is emotionally disturbed and she has been aggressively harassing my prestigious guests. I demand that you place her in handcuffs and remove her from my property immediately." The lead detective did not even break his stride. He did not acknowledge my mother's existence, let alone her ridiculous demands. He simply stepped around her as if she were nothing more than a piece of misplaced furniture. Brenda's fake smile instantly collapsed into a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. As the officers walked right past the grand stage, right past the towering ice sculptures, and marched directly toward the private VIP tables. They moved in perfect unison until they formed a tight, inescapable circle around my arrogant brother-in-law. Trent had been standing near the bar watching my presentation with a look of pale, sweaty terror. But as the uniformed officers surrounded him, his survival instincts kicked in. He desperately tried to pull the shattered pieces of his wealthy white male privilege back together. He puffed out his chest, lifted his chin, and adjusted the lapels of his custom navy tuxedo, trying to physically intimidate men who dealt with actual criminals every single day. "Excuse me, gentlemen," Trent said, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "You are clearly lost, and you are making a massive mistake interrupting this gala. Do you have any idea who I am? I am a senior vice president at one of the largest financial firms in the state of Georgia. I play golf with the chief of police, and I am personal friends with the district attorney. I suggest you turn around and walk out those doors before I make a few phone calls and have every single one of you stripped of your badges by morning." The lead detective stopped exactly 2 feet in front of Trent. He did not flinch at the empty threats, and he did not look impressed by the expensive tuxedo. "Yes, sir," he replied, his deep voice echoing clearly across the dead-silent ballroom, so that every single billionaire and politician in the room could hear him. "We know exactly who you are. Mr. Trenton Elias. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, international money laundering, and corporate embezzlement." The collective gasp from the elite crowd sounded like all the oxygen being sucked out of the room at once. The politicians who had been drinking his champagne just minutes ago physically turned their backs to him, desperate to avoid any photographic association with a federal criminal. Trent opened his mouth to argue, to scream his innocence. But before he could form a single word, 2 officers stepped forward and grabbed his arms. They spun him around, roughly pressing him against the white linen tablecloth of the VIP section. The harsh metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists echoed through the quiet room like a gunshot. Trent's face drained of all human color. His smug, arrogant mask completely disintegrated, leaving nothing but a terrified, trembling man who had just realized his entire life was over. The officers yanked him back to his feet, his arms pinned awkwardly behind his back, his custom suit wrinkling under their firm grips. Sydney let out a blood-curdling scream. She abandoned her position near the stage and sprinted across the ballroom floor, her expensive heels slipping wildly on the marble. She crashed into the officers, sobbing hysterically and clawing at their dark uniforms until they forcefully pushed her back. "Trent, look at me! Trent? What is happening?" she shrieked, her makeup running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. She spun around, frantically searching the crowd until she found my father, who was standing frozen near the bar, looking like a broken, hollow shell of a man. "Daddy, do something!" Sydney screamed, her voice cracking with absolute desperation. "Call your lawyers right now. Write them a check. Daddy, pay his bail, do whatever it takes. Just do not let them take my husband away in handcuffs. You have to fix this, Daddy." David did not move a single inch. He just stared blankly at the floor, completely paralyzed by the realization that his entire empire of lies had just collapsed on top of him. He could not look his favorite daughter in the eye, and he certainly could not look at the police officers, who were now dragging his son-in-law toward the exit. I stepped down from the stage and walked slowly across the room until I was standing just a few feet away from my hysterical sister. The entire ballroom watched me in stunned, breathless silence. I looked down at my watch, checking the time with casual, icy precision before lifting my eyes to meet hers. "He cannot write a check, Sydney," I said, my voice cutting through her frantic sobbing like a sharpened blade. I looked directly at Trent, who had stopped struggling against the officers and was now staring at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. "Daddy cannot save you tonight," I explained smoothly, "because exactly 30 minutes ago, I handed over a secondary file to the federal authorities. I froze every single one of David's personal and corporate accounts for massive, historic tax evasion. He does not have a single dime left to his name." I stepped slightly closer to the officers and offered my brother-in-law a cold, empty smile. "Enjoy the holding cell, Trent." The morning sun cast long, sharp shadows across the polished concrete floor of my executive office. The chaotic events of the previous night had already dominated the local news cycles and the financial blogs. Trent was currently sitting in a federal holding cell downtown, completely stripped of his bespoke suits and his arrogant smirk. The swift and brutal nature of his arrest had sent absolute shockwaves through the Atlanta elite, and the fallout was only just beginning. I sat comfortably behind my massive desk, reviewing the final property transfer documents for the country club when my security chief tapped gently on the heavy glass doors. He informed me that I had 2 visitors waiting in the lobby. They did not have an appointment, and they were not demanding to be let in. According to the security feed, they were just standing there looking completely broken. I did not even have to check the cameras to know exactly who it was. I told him to send them up. The heavy double doors slowly swung open, and David and Brenda shuffled into my office. The arrogant, deeply entitled couple who had tried to publicly destroy me and have me thrown out of a charity gala less than 12 hours ago was completely gone. The illusion of their massive wealth had been violently shattered, and they looked exactly like what they truly were, which was two desperate people who had finally run out of lies to tell. My father was wearing a wrinkled suit that looked like it had been slept in, and his shoulders were slumped so far forward he looked incredibly small. My mother was barely recognizable. Her perfect hair was flat and unstyled, and her face was puffy and red from hours of crying. There was no screaming this time. There were no threats of disownment, and no venomous insults about my education or my software company. They did not storm over to my desk or try to intimidate me with their status. Instead, they stood awkwardly near the entrance, staring at the floor. "Have a seat," I said, gesturing to the leather chairs across from me. My voice was entirely devoid of any emotion. They moved hesitantly and sat down as if the chairs might suddenly collapse beneath them. David cleared his throat nervously, rubbing his trembling hands together. "Morgan," he began, his voice raspy and incredibly weak. "The federal agents showed up at the house at 6 o'clock this morning. They seized absolutely everything. Every single bank account, every investment portfolio, and every line of credit we had left. They said our personal finances were completely linked to Trent's offshore accounts and his massive money laundering schemes. The government has frozen all of our assets and the bank is officially foreclosing on the estate by the end of the week." The neighbors stood on their lawns and watched them tow away the cars. "We have absolutely nothing left." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my expression completely neutral as I looked at the man who used to call me a disappointment at every family holiday. "I know, Dad," I replied softly. "I am the one who handed the authorities the heavily encrypted ledgers. I told you last night that your free ride was over, and I am a woman who keeps her promises. You built your entire lavish lifestyle on a foundation of stolen money and profound deceit. You allowed Trent to hollow out grandfather's legacy just so you could maintain your country club memberships and buy designer clothes. You watched him commit federal crimes and you happily looked the other way because the dirty money was funding your comfortable reality." My mother suddenly leaned forward, gripping the edge of my mahogany desk with her shaking hands. The tears streaming down her face were completely genuine this time. She was absolutely terrified of losing her social status, her mansion, and the only elite identity she had ever known. "Sydney is completely ruined," she sobbed heavily, her chest heaving. "Trent is facing decades in federal prison, and all of her accounts are frozen too. Morgan, baby, please," she cried, her voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate plea. "You have to stop this. We are your parents. We raised you. We gave you everything you needed growing up. You cannot just sit there and let us go completely bankrupt. We will lose the house. We will lose our friends. We will have absolutely nowhere to go. Please, Morgan, you have the money now. You can fix this. You can pay the back taxes and make this all go away. We are a family. You have to help us." The sheer audacity of her words hung heavily in the chilled air of my office. She was actually trying to play the loving mother card after spending her entire life treating me like a worthless burden. I looked at the woman who had spent decades comparing me to my sister, who had actively tried to ruin my business with a viral smear campaign, and who had stood by while her golden son-in-law tried to steal my grandfather's properties. I let her desperate sobbing echo in the room for a long, quiet moment before I finally spoke. I slowly leaned forward and rested my arms on the desk, looking directly into her tear-filled eyes. My voice was incredibly calm, but it carried a deadly absolute weight. "Do you remember the day of grandfather's funeral, Brenda?" I asked softly, watching her face flinch at the sudden question. "The entire city came out to pay their respects to a great man. You and David were so incredibly busy shaking hands with politicians and pretending to be devastated heirs that you completely forgot about me. I was 15 years old, crying my eyes out over the only person in this family who actually loved me and believed in me. You told me to wait in the car so I would not ruin your perfect family photographs with my ugly sobbing. You locked me in a hot car during the funeral of the only man who ever loved me. You left me trapped in that sweltering heat for 4 straight hours in the middle of July while you drank expensive wine at the reception. I almost passed out from the intense heat watching you through the tinted glass while you were busy securing your social status. My parents stared at me in complete, stunned silence. The color had drained from their faces as they realized I had never forgotten a single ounce of their profound cruelty. You did not raise me, Brenda, I stated, my voice dropping to an icy whisper. Grandfather raised me. You just tolerated my existence until you could find a way to get rid of me. You threw me out when I did not fit your perfect, wealthy aesthetic, and you tried to destroy me the moment I became a threat to your greed. I picked up a sleek black folder from my desk and slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested right in front of her shaking hands. So let us get one thing completely straight right now. You are not my parents, I said, my eyes locked onto hers with zero mercy. I bought your massive outstanding debts from the bank this morning, which means I legally own the deed to your foreclosed mansion. You are just my tenants, and your rent is overdue. My parents stared at the black folder as if it were a venomous snake preparing to strike. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Brenda simply stood up, her legs shaking so violently she had to lean against the heavy mahogany chair to keep from collapsing to the floor. They did not say another single word to me. They slowly turned around and walked out of my office looking like two hollow ghosts who had just attended their own funerals. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind them, and for the first time in my life, the suffocating weight of their constant judgment completely vanished from my shoulders. I took a deep breath of the quiet air and went back to work, knowing that the hardest part of my grandfather's justice was finally complete. 3 days later, I was standing in the middle of a massive open-concept dining room in downtown Atlanta. This was the crown jewel of my latest business expansion, a high-end restaurant that I had purchased completely in cash, using the massive profits from my software company. The sprawling space was currently undergoing intense renovations. A crew of contractors were busy installing imported black marble countertops and aggressively sanding down the original oak hardwood floors. The air smelled heavily of fresh paint-cut wood and industrial adhesive. I was reviewing the final architectural blueprints with my lead designer, pointing out the placement of the custom lighting fixtures, when the loud, frantic clicking of designer heels echoed over the noise of the heavy construction equipment. I slowly turned around to see my older sister Sydney marching through the front glass doors of my restaurant. She looked absolutely terrible. The flawless, polished high society socialite who had tried to physically attack the police officers at the charity gala was completely gone. Her bright blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, uneven knot, and the dark bruising circles under her eyes proved she had not slept a single minute since Trent was dragged away in handcuffs. She was wearing a wrinkled beige trench coat over a simple black dress, and her expensive leather handbag was clutched against her chest like a protective shield. She scanned the busy, dusty construction site until her desperate, bloodshot eyes finally locked onto me. "Morgan, we need to talk right now," she demanded, her voice shrill and carrying a frantic, panicked edge that made a few of the nearby contractors pause their work to stare at us. I politely dismissed my designer and walked slowly across the dusty floor to meet her, making sure the white plaster dust coated the bottom of my work boots. I stopped a few feet away from her, keeping my posture completely relaxed and deeply professional. "I do not have a lot of free time, Sydney," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even and calm. "I am opening this restaurant in less than a month, and I have a very strict operational schedule to maintain. What exactly do you want from me?" She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing nervously as she glanced at the burly construction workers before stepping closer to me. Her eyes darted around the large, empty room, like a trapped, terrified animal looking for an escape route. "Trent was denied bail early this morning," she whispered, her voice trembling with absolute sheer panic. "The federal prosecutors are officially moving forward with the wire fraud and corporate embezzlement charges. His own expensive defense attorneys told him he has to take a plea deal because the financial evidence you provided is just too overwhelming. They are talking about locking him away in a federal penitentiary for 10 straight years. Morgan. 10 years. They have completely frozen our joint banking accounts, and the leasing company is actively threatening to repossess my car. I cannot live like this. I cannot be married to a convicted felon, and I absolutely cannot survive being poor. I stared at her, letting her pathetic whining hang in the dusty air. And exactly how is any of that my problem? I asked smoothly, tilting my head just a fraction. She took another step forward, her eyes widening with a sickening kind of desperate, ugly greed. Because I can give you everything else, she said, her voice dropping even lower so the workers could not hear her. I know exactly where Trent hid the secondary encrypted hard drives. I know the private passwords to David's offshore shell accounts that the IRS investigators have not managed to find yet. I was the one who listened to Brenda complain about shuffling the fake charity funds. I was sitting right there in the room when they planned all of it. Morgan, I will give you absolute full cooperation. I will sit down with the federal agents tomorrow morning and I will testify against every single one of them. I will happily hand over my own husband and our parents to the authorities and give you the ultimate final victory you have been wanting. She paused, taking a shaky, uneven breath before delivering her ultimate selfish demand. All I want in exchange is my rightful half of grandfather's original inheritance. You have total, complete control of the massive estate now. Just quietly wire me my 50% share so I can move to Europe and start my life over. Cut me a check big enough to maintain my standard of living and I will gladly help you bury them under the prison. I will give you everything you need to destroy them permanently. I looked at my older sister, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, chilling disgust. I studied her panicked, greedy face, trying to find even a single trace of human decency or basic familial loyalty. There was absolutely nothing there. Her entire soul was completely hollow. "You are truly unbelievable, Sydney," I said, my voice laced with a cold, quiet venom that made her physically flinch. "You spent your entire life mocking me, treating me like a pathetic loser because I actually worked for my money instead of marrying into it. You worshipped Trent. You paraded him around the city like a shiny trophy, and you happily basked in the stolen wealth he provided. You smiled and drank expensive champagne while David and Brenda legally robbed our grandfather's charity foundation. But the very second the dirty money runs out, the exact moment the illusion shatters, and the severe consequences finally arrive, you are instantly ready to throw every single one of them to the wolves." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing her to stumble backward, her expensive shoes slipping slightly on the dusty floor. "You would actually sell out the man you married and the parents who spoiled you rotten just to keep your designer bags and your precious country club status," I stated, laying her profound emptiness bare for everyone to see. "You have no loyalty to anyone or anything but yourself. You are so utterly terrified of losing your luxury cars and your high society gossip circles that you are literally begging to turn state witness against your own blood. You truly are completely empty inside." Sydney opened her mouth, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson with a mixture of severe shame and defensive rage, but I did not let her speak another word. I reached over to a nearby construction utility cart and picked up a heavy wooden string mop and a bright yellow plastic bucket. I dropped the heavy bucket onto the dusty floor right at her feet with a loud, sharp clatter and shoved the long wooden handle of the mop directly into her trembling hands. She stared down at the cleaning supplies in absolute stunned horror. "I do not need your testimony, Sydney," I said, my voice dropping to a final, absolute freezing tone. "I already gave the federal authorities every single document, encrypted file, and bank statement they need to put Trent away for a decade. Your information is completely worthless to me." I looked down at the dirty mop she was now awkwardly holding against her expensive designer trench coat. "But I do need a janitor for my new restaurant," I added, turning away from her shocked, pathetic expression to walk back toward my lead designer. "The position pays minimum wage. Take it or leave it." I left Sydney standing entirely motionless in the middle of the dusty construction site, her hands trembling around the wooden handle of the cheap yellow mop. I did not look back as I walked out the glass doors of the restaurant and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. My driver was waiting by the curb, and he silently opened the door to the sleek black sedan. I gave him a single destination and leaned back against the plush leather seats, watching the city of Atlanta blur past the tinted windows. The relentless, chaotic noise of my family and their desperate, pathetic greed was finally fading away, leaving me with a profound and heavy silence. 30 minutes later, the car pulled through the towering iron gates of the Elias estate. The sprawling mansion looked completely different today. The imported luxury cars were gone from the circular driveway, and the loud, obnoxious chatter of my mother's high society friends no longer echoed across the manicured lawns. The house was completely empty. The bank had finalized the foreclosure, and my aggressive property acquisition meant that I was now the sole owner of the very estate where I had grown up, feeling like a worthless ghost. I unlocked the heavy mahogany front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The silence inside was absolute and absolute perfection. I walked slowly past the formal dining room and the massive sweeping staircase, ignoring the opulent spaces that Brenda and David had decorated to show off their fake wealth. I was only here for one specific room. Tucked away at the very end of the long western hallway was my grandfather's private study. It was the one place in this massive hollow mansion that had actually felt like a home to me. My parents had completely ignored this room since his passing, refusing to enter it because it smelled too much like the old man they had secretly despised. I turned the brass handle and pushed the heavy oak door open. The air inside was thick with the comforting, familiar scent of aged, leather-bound books, rich pipe tobacco, and old paper. The thick velvet curtains were drawn tight against the afternoon sun, casting the room in deep, quiet shadows. I walked over to his massive mahogany desk and gently ran my fingers along the polished wood. This was where he used to sit for hours, explaining the complex world of finance to me, while the rest of the family was out wasting his hard-earned money. I closed my eyes, taking a deep breath of the lingering scent, and felt a sharp, painful ache in my chest. I moved around the desk and stood in front of the tall, built-in bookshelves that lined the back wall. My grandfather had always been a man of immense secrets and careful preparations. He had taught me that a smart business leader never leaves their true assets entirely exposed. I reached out and pressed my hand against the wooden paneling behind a row of heavy leather encyclopedias, just the way he had casually shown me when I was 14 years old. The panel gave way with a soft, mechanical click, sliding smoothly to the side to reveal a sleek, digital safe embedded directly into the reinforced wall. I typed in the 6-digit code without hesitating. It was the exact date of the afternoon we had spent together feeding the ducks at the local park when everyone else had forgotten my birthday. The heavy steel door popped open with a quiet beep. Inside the dark metal cavity, there was no cash and no expensive jewelry. There was only a simple black velvet box and a thick manila folder. I pulled the box out and carried it over to his desk, carefully lifting the lid. Inside, resting on the soft cushion, was a silver encrypted USB drive. I opened my laptop and plugged the small drive into the port. A single video file appeared on my screen. My hands were shaking slightly as I moved the cursor and clicked play. The screen flickered for a second before the image sharpened. My grandfather was sitting in the exact same leather chair I was standing behind. He looked incredibly frail, his skin pale and his breathing slightly labored, but his piercing blue eyes were just as sharp and brilliant as I remembered. "Hello, Morgan." His deep, raspy voice filled the quiet study, wrapping around me like a warm, protective blanket. If you are watching this video, it means I am gone, and the inevitable greed of David and Brenda has finally brought everything crashing down. I let out a shaky breath, pulling out his desk chair and slowly sitting down, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. "I want you to know the absolute truth." My grandfather continued, looking directly into the camera lens with a heavy, sorrowful expression. "I knew exactly what David was doing. I knew he was a complete fraud, and I knew he was quietly siphoning money from the charity foundation to fund his pathetic country club lifestyle. I watched him and Trent manipulate the corporate ledgers, and I watched Brenda turn my home into a shallow circus. I could have stopped them, Morgan. I could have exposed them years ago. But I knew that if I did, they would simply find another way to hide their crimes, and they would eventually drag you down with them. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk, and his expression softened into a look of profound, unconditional pride. The kind of pride my parents had never once shown me. I had to let them think they were winning, he said softly. I had to let them build their house of cards so high that when it finally collapsed, it would bury them completely. But more importantly, I had to give you the time and the shadows you needed to grow. A single warm tear slipped down my cheek, splashing onto the polished mahogany desk. My grandfather smiled gently through the digital screen. They called you a dropout, Morgan. They mocked you at the dinner table, and they called you a failure because you refused to play their shallow games. But I saw you studying code at 3 in the morning. I saw the brilliance in your eyes when you talked about financial software. I saw you quietly building an empire in the shadows while they were busy polishing their fake crowns. You have always been the smartest person in this family. You are my true legacy, Morgan. Not David, not Sydney, and certainly not Trent. You are the only one who actually understood the value of hard work. He took a slow, rattling breath before his expression shifted back to one of pure, calculated business authority. Which is why I made one final preparation before I passed, he stated, leaning back into his leather chair. David believes he found all of my accounts. The federal government believes they seized the entirety of the Elias fortune. They are both completely wrong. I knew what would happen to the foundation. So years ago, I quietly liquidated the absolute core of my personal wealth. I moved the real money entirely out of their reach. My heart hammered violently against my ribs as I stared at the screen. Inside the folder in the safe, you will find the routing numbers and the legal ownership documents for a massive offshore account. My grandfather revealed, his eyes gleaming with a brilliant, triumphant spark. The account is completely untraceable, and it is locked under a private corporate trust that only you have the biometric clearance to access. There are over $3 billion sitting in that account, Morgan. And it is dedicated purely to the expansion of your fintech firm. Use it to build your empire. Use it to change the world. I love you, my brilliant girl. The screen faded to black, leaving me sitting in the total silence of the empty mansion. I reached over with trembling hands and pulled the thick manila folder from the safe. As I opened the cover and saw the verified bank statement stamped with my name and a 10-digit balance, the reality of his final brilliant move washed over me. He had outsmarted them all from beyond the grave, and he had given me the ultimate weapon to conquer the financial world. I sat in the quiet study for a long time, just staring at the 10-digit balance printed on the thick manila paper. The sheer magnitude of what my grandfather had done was still washing over me. He had practically handed me the keys to the entire financial kingdom while leaving my parents fighting over the scraps of a hollowed-out charity foundation. He knew they would destroy themselves with their own greed, and he had set the stage perfectly. I carefully placed the documents and the silver USB drive into my leather briefcase and walked out of the mansion for the final time, locking the heavy mahogany doors behind me. The sound of the deadbolt clicking shut felt like the official end of an era. The next morning, I was sitting in my glass corner office reviewing the offshore account transfers when my head of public relations burst through the heavy double doors. She dropped a sleek tablet onto my desk, showing a live promotional feed for Channel 8 News, which was the most watched local broadcast station in Atlanta. David had apparently reached out to their producers late the night before and promised them an exclusive, explosive interview about the sudden fall of the Elias family empire. The promo teased that he was going to go on live television and claim that I had illegally manipulated grandfather's estate and stolen the family wealth from right under them. He was trying to win in the court of public opinion now that he had completely lost in the actual court of law. I did not panic, and I certainly did not call my corporate lawyers to issue a frantic cease and desist order. Instead, I smiled a very cold and calculating smile. I told my PR director to call the network executives immediately. I leveraged my massive status as the new legal owner of the Elias properties and the highly successful CEO of a major fintech firm to demand a seat on that exact same broadcast. The news network was absolutely thrilled by the prospect of a live, unscripted family confrontation, and they eagerly agreed to format the segment as a joint interview. I told them I would bring exclusive unseen video evidence regarding the true nature of the estate. 2 days later, I walked into the freezing air-conditioned television studio wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit and an expression of complete, absolute calm. The bright studio lights glared down on the sleek, modern broadcast set, illuminating the nervous faces of the camera crew. David was already sitting in one of the plush leather chairs across from the prominent local anchor. He looked up as I walked confidently onto the set, and his face instantly paled, losing all of its fake color. He had expected to smear my name without any opposition, and seeing me standing there holding a small silver object completely derailed his pathetic strategy. I took the empty seat directly beside him, crossing my legs and ignoring his furious, panicked glares. The floor director counted down from 5, holding up his fingers, and the red light on the main camera blinked on, indicating we were broadcasting live to the entire city. The anchor introduced the segment with a dramatic, practiced voice detailing the sudden, shocking collapse of the elite Elias family and the highly publicized foreclosure of our historic estate. She then turned her sympathetic gaze to my father, offering him the floor to explain his side of the tragic story. David immediately launched into a heavily rehearsed, Oscar-worthy performance. He manufactured a look of deep, profound heartbreak, dropping his shoulders, and actually managed to squeeze out a few fake tears for the high-definition cameras. He looked directly into the lens and painted himself as a grieving, dedicated son who had been violently betrayed by his own greedy, vindictive daughter. He claimed that I had used predatory legal tactics to seize his home out from under him while he was still mourning his beloved father. He told the citizens of Atlanta that I had completely fabricated the federal embezzlement charges against Trent just so I could forcefully take over the family charity and steal the remaining inheritance to fund my software company. He called me a ruthless corporate monster who cared more about power and money than my own flesh and blood. He practically begged the viewers to see him as a victim of my unnatural ambition. I sat there perfectly still, letting him dig his own grave on live television. I let him spin his intricate web of desperate lies until the anchor finally turned to me, asking how I could possibly justify treating my vulnerable parents with such extreme, calculated cruelty. I did not raise my voice, and I did not bother arguing with a single word he had just said. Defending myself against a liar only gives the lie validity. Instead, I reached into my suit pocket and pulled out the silver USB drive my grandfather had left in the hidden safe. I placed it softly on the glass table between us where the studio lights caught its metallic edge. I told the anchor that I did not need to defend myself because my grandfather had already recorded a final definitive statement before he passed away, and I requested that they play the file for their viewers right now. The production team had already screened the file in the control room and cleared it for broadcast, so the anchor eagerly signaled the producers. The large digital monitor behind us flickered to life. David's fake tears instantly vanished the very second grandfather's face appeared on the giant screen. The entire studio fell dead silent as Elias' voice echoed through the high-tech room and into thousands of living rooms across the city. He detailed exactly how he knew his son was a complete fraud. He explicitly described watching David and Trent siphon money from the charity foundation to fund their lavish, pathetic country club lifestyles. He stated clearly that he had let them build their house of cards just so it would ultimately crush them. Then my grandfather's voice shifted, filling the studio with absolute unyielding pride. He praised my silent strength and told the entire world how I was the only one who truly understood hard work. "They called you a dropout, Morgan?" His voice boomed over the studio speakers. But I saw you studying code at 3 in the morning. I saw you building an empire in the shadows while they were busy playing dress-up with my money. You are my true legacy." Grandfather's face looked directly into the camera as he revealed his final brilliant maneuver. He announced the existence of the massive offshore account containing billions of dollars, dedicated purely to my fintech firm, proving once and for all that I was the sole chosen heir to the true Elias empire. The video ended and the heavy screen faded to black, leaving a profound, stunned silence in the broadcast room. The anchor slowly turned her shocked, wide eyes toward my father. David was sitting frozen in his chair, sweating profusely under the bright, hot studio lights, his jaw trembling and his mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the horrifying, inescapable realization finally set in that the entire city of Atlanta now knew he was an absolute fraud. The fallout from the live television broadcast had been absolutely biblical in its scope and destruction. The moment the camera stopped rolling that day, David had literally collapsed in his chair, unable to speak or even look at the anchor who was staring at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. The network had replayed my grandfather's confession every single hour for an entire month, making sure every single person in the state saw exactly who my father really was. The city of Atlanta had completely devoured the scandal, and my parents' high society friends had dropped them faster than a bad habit. Their prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked, their massive credit lines were instantly shut down, and the local authorities had immediately opened a massive federal investigation into their fraudulent charity dealings. But today was not about the impending criminal charges or the endless public humiliation. Today was about the final 30-day eviction notice officially expiring. The sun was shining brightly as my sleek black car pulled up to the towering iron gates of the massive estate for the very last time. I stepped out onto the pristine green lawn, wearing a simple dark suit and holding a hot cup of coffee. The circular driveway was completely packed, but not with the luxury imported cars my parents used to show off to their shallow friends. Instead, there were 3 marked county sheriff vehicles and 2 massive white moving trucks, parked right in front of the grand mahogany doors. The heavy front doors were propped wide open, and a crew of burly movers in matching gray uniforms were already hauling out mountains of cardboard boxes and hastily wrapped furniture. I took a sip of my coffee and leaned against the hood of my car, watching the chaotic scene unfold with a sense of deep, quiet peace. A loud, shrill scream suddenly echoed from inside the cavernous foyer, cutting through the calm morning air. It was Brenda. I slowly walked up the front steps and stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light of the massive entryway. The scene playing out in front of me was both pathetic and incredibly satisfying. 2 uniformed sheriff's officers were standing at the base of the grand sweeping staircase, looking extremely annoyed and completely out of patience. My mother was sprawled out on the middle steps, her arms wrapped tightly around the ornate mahogany banister, like a desperate child refusing to leave a playground. She was wearing a wrinkled silk robe, and her perfectly styled hair was now a tangled, messy nest. "You cannot do this!" she shrieked at the officers, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "I am Brenda Elias, and I host the annual spring gala in this beautiful house, so you have absolutely no right to touch my things." I watched silently as a mover walked past her, carrying an open box overflowing with her supposedly priceless collection of designer handbags and luxury accessories. One of the bags shifted, and the cheap synthetic leather handle snapped right off, falling onto the marble floor with a dull thud. The grand illusion was literally falling apart in real time right in front of the authorities. Even their prized possessions were complete knockoffs, bought in secret to maintain a fake image of extreme wealth, while they quietly drained the charity accounts to keep up appearances. Another mover carried out a large, supposedly original oil painting, but the cheap canvas flapped loosely against a flimsy wooden frame, proving it was nothing more than a mass-produced print. The sheriff's deputy sighed heavily and warned my mother that if she did not release the banister and walk out the front door voluntarily, they would be forced to physically remove her from the premises and charge her with criminal trespassing. David was standing near the entrance of the formal dining room, looking like a hollow, transparent shell of the arrogant man who had tried to destroy me on live television just 30 days ago. He was wearing a faded polo shirt, and he was completely ignoring his wailing wife as she begged the police for mercy. He just stared blankly at the bare walls, watching the movers strip away the last remaining pieces of his fraudulent identity. The expensive rugs were rolled up, the imported vases were packed away, and the house was slowly returning to its cold, empty state. I stepped fully into the foyer, and the sharp click of my boots on the marble floor made both of my parents freeze instantly. Brenda slowly turned her head to look at me, her tear-streaked face twisting into a mask of pure venom and profound, desperate terror. "Morgan!" She gasped, her grip on the wooden banister slipping slightly as she struggled to pull herself up. "Tell them to stop right now and tell them you made a massive mistake. You own the bank debt now, so you can just cancel the eviction and let us stay in the guest wing. We will not bother you, and we will be perfectly quiet, and you will never even know we are here." I just stared at her, letting her pathetic bargaining echo through the empty halls of the house she had stolen. I took another slow sip of my coffee and looked directly at the deputy, telling him he could proceed with the final clearing of the property. Brenda let out a horrifying wail as the officers finally stepped forward and gently but firmly pried her manicured hands off the expensive wood of the staircase. She fought them the entire way down the stairs, her silk robe dragging across the dusty marble floor. She was screaming about her social status, about her wealthy friends, about how she was the lady of the manor, and how she deserved ultimate respect from everyone in the city. David simply turned around and walked out the front door without saying a single word to anyone, completely abandoning his wife to her very public humiliation. I followed them out into the bright sunlight, watching as the officers practically carried Brenda down the front steps and deposited her onto the manicured grass. The movers slammed the heavy metal doors of the box trucks shut, locking away the cheap fake replicas of their entirely hollow lives. My mother sat there on the pristine green lawn, the very same lawn where she used to host extravagant parties to impress people who secretly hated her. The sheriff's deputies walked back to their cruisers, their job finally done. The massive estate was officially empty, and it legally belonged to me and my fintech firm to do with as I pleased. The soft morning breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak trees as I stood on the driveway looking down at the woman who had spent my entire childhood telling me I was a worthless, unlovable disappointment. Brenda slowly pushed herself up until she was resting on her knees, her hands sinking into the damp earth. The silk robe was stained with grass and dirt, and her face was completely devoid of that arrogant, wealthy pride she had worn like an iron mask for decades. She looked up at me, her chest heaving with exhausted, broken sobs. Her eyes were wide and filled with a cold, terrifying realization that the game was actually over, and there was absolutely no one left to manipulate. She wiped a streak of dirt from her cheek with a shaking hand and stared at me with pure, absolute defeat. "Where are we supposed to go? Where are we supposed to go?" The desperate, pathetic question hung in the warm morning air completely unanswered. I looked down at Brenda kneeling in the damp dirt, her expensive silk robe stained and her hands shaking as she waited for me to offer her a lifeline. She was waiting for the obedient, desperate daughter she used to abuse to suddenly reappear and save her from the consequences of her own horrific actions. I stared into her tear-filled eyes and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no guilt, no lingering attachment. The invisible chains that had bound me to her approval for 30 years were completely gone. "I am not a real estate agent, Brenda," I finally said, my voice eerily calm and completely detached. "Finding housing for evicted tenants is not my responsibility." She flinched as if I had physically struck her across the face. Tears continued to spill over her cheeks, cutting clean tracks through the dust on her face, but I knew they were not tears of remorse. She was only crying for the mansion. She had lost the country club status she would never regain, and the designer clothes that were currently being driven away in the back of a moving truck. My father, David, was standing a few yards away near the massive iron gates, completely paralyzed and staring at the pavement. He did not even try to come back and comfort his wife. He just stood there completely defeated, a cowardly fraud who had finally run out of lies to tell. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, telling me I was a massive disappointment simply because I refused to participate in their shallow, greedy games. They had worshipped Trent and Sydney, treating them like royalty, while plotting to steal my grandfather's legacy and completely ruin my life. The silence stretched between us, heavy and absolute. The huge estate behind me was entirely locked down, the massive wooden doors bolted shut, and the security systems fully activated under my name. The entire sprawling property that Brenda had used to terrorize the local socialites now belonged to the very daughter she had thrown away. I watched her chest heave as she gasped for air, her perfect manicured nails digging deep into the wet soil of the front lawn. She was waiting for me to break. She was waiting for me to show a single ounce of familial mercy so she could sink her venomous claws right back into my life and start leeching off my massive success. I slowly reached my hand into the inner pocket of my tailored charcoal suit jacket. My fingers brushed against a crisp piece of paper that I had been carrying with me ever since that awful night in the back of the hired limousine. I slowly pulled out the folded $20 bill, holding it casually between my index and middle finger. It was the exact same bill Trent had casually thrown at my face after mocking my software company and telling me my business was nothing more than a pathetic little hobby. He had flicked it at me like I was a homeless beggar, telling me to buy myself a cheap cup of coffee, while the real adults handled the massive corporate business and planned their fake charitable empire. Brenda stared at the green piece of paper in my hand, her red, puffy eyes blinking in total confusion. She had no idea what the money meant or where it came from, but she could sense the absolute cold finality of the moment. She reached a trembling hand up toward me, her mouth opening to beg for another chance to ask for forgiveness she did not actually feel. I stepped a few inches closer to her, making sure she could see the cold, unyielding emptiness in my eyes. I held the crisp $20 bill out over her trembling shoulders and slowly opened my fingers. The green paper fluttered in the soft morning breeze, drifting down until it landed softly on the damp grass right next to her dirty knees. She stared down at it, her mouth falling open as the profound, sheer disrespect of the gesture finally registered in her desperate mind. "Buy yourself a coffee," I said, my voice perfectly mirroring the arrogant, dismissive tone Trent had used that night in the car. "The adults are working." Her face completely crumpled, folding into an expression of absolute utter devastation. A low, agonizing sob tore from her throat as she realized the complete finality of my words. She was no longer a wealthy socialite, she was no longer the lady of the manor, and she was no longer my mother. She was just a desperate evicted tenant crying on the lawn, holding a single $20 bill. I did not wait for her to speak again. I turned my back on her and walked confidently down the long, sweeping driveway. The heavy leather soles of my boots echoed against the pavement, drowning out the pathetic sounds of her weeping. I did not even glance at David as I passed him by the massive iron gates. He was just a ghost, a lingering, empty shadow of a man who had chosen greed over his own flesh and blood and lost absolutely everything in the process. My personal chauffeur was standing at attention, holding the rear door of the sleek, custom black Maybach wide open for me. He offered a polite, respectful nod as I approached, his expression completely professional and entirely blank. I stepped into the quiet, luxurious interior of the massive car, sinking into the rich, soft leather seats. The heavy door clicked shut instantly, sealing away the chaotic noise of the morning and the pathetic sobs of the woman on the lawn. The cabin was perfectly climate-controlled and smelled faintly of expensive cologne and brand-new leather. Drive, I instructed my driver, keeping my eyes focused straight ahead on the road. The powerful engine purred to life, with a deep, quiet rumble gliding smoothly down the wealthy suburban street. I let myself look at the tinted rearview mirror one final time. David and Brenda were just two small, pathetic figures standing on the curb outside the massive iron gates, completely surrounded by nothing but empty space and the wreckage of their own ruined lives. They had no money, no credit, no home, and absolutely no one left to exploit. The heavy car turned the corner smoothly, picking up speed as we headed toward the towering glass skyscrapers of downtown Atlanta. I watched the skyline approach, feeling a deep, profound sense of absolute peace settle over my entire being. They had tried to bury me in the dark, but they had completely forgotten that I was a seed. The past was officially dead and my empire was just beginning. 1 month had passed since the morning I left my parents kneeling in the damp grass of their foreclosed estate. 30 days was a remarkably short amount of time for an entire dynasty to turn into dust. But the Elias family had always been built on fragile lies anyway. I was standing in the center of the massive glass atrium of my newly renovated commercial plaza in the historic Sweet Auburn district. The multi-million-dollar project had been my primary focus for the last 2 years, and today was the official unannounced soft opening. The natural sunlight poured through the geometric skylights, casting warm, bright patterns across the imported Italian marble floors. My lead architect and the head of my property management division were walking briskly beside me, holding their tablets and hanging on to every single word I said. I pointed out a minor flaw in the brass detailing near the central fountain, and the manager immediately scrambled to make a note, promising it would be fixed by tomorrow morning. It was a strange and intoxicating feeling to walk through a space of this magnitude, knowing that every square inch of it belonged entirely to me. The plaza was already packed with eager shoppers and curious locals. I had designed the space to cater to the absolute highest tier of Atlanta society, bringing in exclusive boutique brands and high-end culinary concepts that had never before opened locations in the city. As we walked past the gleaming storefronts, I recognized several faces in the crowd. There were wealthy socialites, corporate executives, and prominent politicians who used to attend my mother's lavish fake charity galas. They used to look right past me when I was just the awkward, forgotten middle child standing in the shadows of the mansion, but now they were eagerly spending their money in a building bearing my corporate logo. None of them knew I was the owner, as I had kept my name off all the public-facing documents, preferring to let my holding company take the credit. But the quiet, anonymous victory was sweeter than any public applause could ever be. They were funding the very empire they had once mocked. We made our way toward the northern wing of the complex, which housed the artisanal food pavilion. It was a sprawling, open-concept dining area filled with expensive cafes, organic juice bars, and gourmet bistros. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasted coffee beans and fresh pastries. I paused near the entrance of the pavilion, folding my arms across my tailored silk blouse as I surveyed the bustling lunch crowd. My architect was explaining the acoustic engineering of the vaulted ceilings, but my attention was suddenly drawn to a specific figure working near the back wall near the waste disposal bins. Amidst the sea of glamorous, wealthy patrons dressed in designer clothes, there was a stark, jarring contrast. It was a maintenance worker wearing a stiff, cheap polyester uniform in a bright, obnoxious shade of yellow. The worker was hunched over a sticky table, furiously scrubbing at a spilled, dark liquid with a damp gray rag. She was moving with a frantic, panicked energy, as if she was terrified of losing her job over a simple mess. I stepped slightly closer, narrowing my eyes as the bright afternoon light caught the side of her face. My breath hitched in my chest for a split second as the reality of the situation washed over me. It was my older sister, Sydney. I stood absolutely frozen just watching her work. The physical transformation was shocking and completely undeniable. The beautiful, arrogant golden child, who had spent her entire life looking down on everyone else, was entirely gone. Her expensive blonde highlights had grown out, revealing dark, brassy roots that were pulled back into a messy, frizzy ponytail secured with a cheap elastic band. Her skin looked pale and exhausted, completely stripped of the expensive spa treatments and premium cosmetics she used to buy with the stolen charity funds. Her hands, the exact same hands that had never done a single day of hard labor in her entire life, were red and raw, immersed in cheap industrial cleaning chemicals. She looked broken, tired, and entirely defeated by the real world she had successfully avoided for 30 years. As I watched her, a group of 4 young women walked into the food pavilion, holding several heavy shopping bags from the luxury boutiques upstairs. I immediately recognized them as part of Sydney's old inner circle from her exclusive country club days. They were laughing loudly and tossing their perfectly styled hair, looking around for a clean place to sit. Sydney looked up from the sticky table and saw them approaching. The sheer absolute terror that washed over her face was palpable, even from 30 feet away. She instantly froze, dropping her cleaning rag onto the table and shrinking into herself. She turned her body completely around, facing the blank wall and pulling the collar of her cheap yellow uniform up around her neck, trying desperately to hide her face from the people who used to worship her. Her shoulders were shaking slightly, and I could see the deep, profound shame radiating from her tense posture. The group of wealthy women walked right past her, bumping her shoulder without even apologizing or looking at her. They just saw another invisible worker in a cheap uniform taking up space in their glamorous world. Sydney kept her face buried against the wall until they were safely out of sight. When she finally turned back around to pick up her dirty rag, her eyes were brimming with hot, humiliated tears. She looked up and our eyes met across the crowded food court. I saw the instant recognition flash across her tired face. She stopped breathing entirely. Her raw, red hands gripped the edges of the table so hard her knuckles turned white. I could see the exact moment her mind raced through 1,000 different terrified thoughts. She was expecting me to walk over there and gloat. She was bracing herself for me to throw her failures in her face to remind her of every single time she had called me a loser or a dropout when we were teenagers. She stood there paralyzed, waiting for the inevitable crushing confrontation, waiting for me to deliver the final killing blow to her shattered ego. She looked like a trapped animal waiting for the hunter to strike. I simply adjusted the cuff of my silk blouse and resumed my walking pace. I walked directly toward her, my expensive heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor. Sydney held her breath, shrinking back against the edge of the table, her eyes wide with fear and anticipation. I walked right past her. I did not slow down. I did not turn my head. I did not offer her a smirk, a smile, or even a single passing glance of recognition. I looked straight through her as if she was nothing more than an empty space in the room. She was completely and utterly invisible to me. I heard a sharp, ragged gasp slip from her throat as I passed by, but I just kept walking, listening to my architect talk about the lighting fixtures. I had finally realized that the ultimate revenge was not anger, and it was not a dramatic confrontation. The ultimate disrespect was total, absolute apathy. She was simply a stranger cleaning tables in my building, and I had an empire to run. 6 months passed since that afternoon in the loud, crowded food court. The city of Atlanta had moved on, and so had I. The sticky, humid heat of the Georgia summer had finally broken, giving way to a crisp, clear autumn morning. I stood behind the heavy black velvet curtain of the main stage, taking a deep, slow breath. This was not just another corporate event or a shallow charity gala like the ones my parents used to throw just to hear the sound of their own names. Those parties were entirely built on lies and stolen money. This was the grand opening of the Elias Innovation Center for Black Tech Entrepreneurs. I had taken one of the massive abandoned brick warehouses in the historic Sweet Auburn district and completely transformed it into a state-of-the-art incubator. The old exposed brick walls and heavy steel beams were now lined with glowing digital displays, high-speed fiber optic networks, and collaborative open workspaces. My grandfather had left me a massive hidden fortune to build my empire, but he had also taught me that true power was never about hoarding wealth. True power was about creating opportunity for the brilliant people who actually deserved it. I had poured $50 million of the offshore trust directly into this center. It was specifically designed to fund elevate and protect young minds who were constantly overlooked and undervalued by the traditional elite investors. The massive auditorium was already buzzing with a vibrant electric energy. I peeked through a small gap in the heavy velvet curtain and watched hundreds of people filling the sleek, modern seats. There were no fake plastic smiles and no hollow, arrogant socialites in this room. These were real people with raw talent and a desperate, hungry drive to change the world. Sitting in the very front row, wearing a sharp vintage suit and leaning comfortably on his polished wooden cane, was Mr. Holloway. He caught my eye through the gap in the curtain and offered a slow, proud nod. He had been my absolute mentor, my quiet, fierce guardian, when my own father had turned his back on me. Mr. Holloway had taught me how to read the complex financial markets, how to build intricate code from scratch, and how to survive in a corporate world that constantly told me I was not enough. He was my true family now, along with my dedicated executive team and the fiercely loyal friends who had stood by me when I was just the forgotten daughter living in the shadows. I let the heavy fabric of the curtain fall back into place and closed my eyes for just a moment, letting the reality of my life sink in. I was incredibly wealthy, beyond anything David and Brenda had ever falsely claimed to be. But more importantly, I was completely at peace. My companies were thriving. My personal life was rich with genuine connection, and my mind was no longer plagued by the constant desperate need for my parents' validation. I had spent so many years trying to figure out how to fit into their shallow mold, how to make them love me the way they loved my siblings. Now I realized that their inability to love me was never a reflection of my worth. It was entirely a reflection of their own profound emptiness. The house lights slowly dimmed, and the loud, excited chatter of the crowd settled into a respectful, expectant hush. My director of public relations gave me a quick thumbs up from the elevated sound booth at the back of the room. I pushed the heavy velvet curtain aside and walked out onto the brightly lit stage. I was wearing a tailored emerald green suit that perfectly matched the new branding of my fintech empire. The applause that erupted from the crowd was deafening and completely genuine. I walked up to the clear acrylic podium and looked out over the vast sea of eager, hopeful faces. They were young men and women who had been repeatedly told they were too poor, too inexperienced, or simply too different to ever succeed. I saw myself in every single one of their eyes. I adjusted the microphone and let a calm, peaceful smile touch my lips. "Welcome to the future," I said, and my voice echoed powerfully through the massive high-tech auditorium. For a very long time, the name Elias represented greed, exclusion, and hollow arrogance in this city. It represented closed doors and wealthy gatekeepers who cared much more about the expensive designer labels on your clothes than the brilliant, innovative ideas in your head. But today we are completely rewriting that toxic legacy. Today we are tearing down those iron gates forever, and we are building a new table where everyone has a seat and everyone has a voice. The crowd erupted into cheers again, and as I watched them celebrate, I felt a profound, absolute peace wash over my entire being. The heavy, dark ghosts of my past were finally dead and gone. David and Brenda were currently living in a cramped, miserable one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, entirely forgotten by the high society world they had literally worshipped. Trent was facing a decade in federal prison for his massive corporate fraud and embezzlement schemes, completely stripped of his golden boy status. Sydney was still scrubbing sticky tables in a loud food court, trying desperately to hide her face from the very people she used to rule with cruel high school gossip. They had spent my entire life trying to crush my spirit. They had tried to make me feel like an ugly, worthless stain on their perfect family portrait. But their relentless cruelty had only forged me into an unbreakable diamond. They had inadvertently handed me the exact tools I needed to orchestrate their absolute downfall. I had taken their hate and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar empire that would change the world. The auditorium quieted down as I raised my hand to speak again. I leaned closer to the microphone, looking directly into the main broadcast camera, positioned at the back of the room. The red recording light blinked steadily, capturing my image for the entire world to see. They called me the ugly dropout. They locked me out in the heat so I would not ruin their perfect picture. But they forgot one thing. When you lock someone out, you leave them with the entire world to conquer. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to find your true worth? Tell me your story in the comments. Hit like, subscribe, and remember your greatest revenge is your undeniable success.